Hello, welcome to No Unscripted Utopia, episode 2. It's actually 0 Hour Utopia, but whatever, too many names. I'm No One. This is the second episode of Utopia. The name of it is Suckle. You'll figure it out as the more the episodes go on. Every single part of every one of my playlists have the words have meaning, so the names have meaning, and I'll talk about that at some point. But today, we're going to talk about something that's very heavy and very relevant. And no one would have believed me, and no one still will. Now, I did a video about introducing myself that talks about it. Why I feel that I was, Providence ordained me to live through what I lived through and study what I've studied, to have it become almost muscle memory for me. So I have all these things going around in my head when I see what's happening. And these episodes in this project, No One Unscripted, wasn't started for any other purpose but to expand the curiosity, or reawaken the curiosity of my fellow Americans and also everybody else in the world. So for some time after I did my last one was about Joe Biden, and I think this is the third episode. I think I may have messed up. Anyway, I'll fix that later. Whatever. You can hasten the speed of this video because I tend to lag around a bit because I don't script anything that I'm talking about. I was thinking about this very topic, and because I studied these topics, and today I said to myself, I'm going to do this video, and I was trying to figure out how to frame it. What would be the question? What's the issue? So just maybe 10 minutes ago or whatever, one of my friends on Twitter retweeted Bishop Talbert Swan, who asked a very, very interesting question. And I don't know if this question is rhetorical or if this curiosity has finally risen in everybody. Instead of blaming it on white supremacy or racism without understanding the history, psychology, and philosophy behind it. And so today what I'm going to try to do is, no, I'm not going to try. Today what I'm going to do is tell you everything that I know, that I've learned about this very topic. So I'll start with the question that Bishop Swan presents on Twitter. His tweet on the 16th of January 2021, which I just saw, I didn't know about. And I've commented on his comments before. I've never followed him on Twitter because I was compulsive about and focused on just getting the word out that something was going to happen all the way from November. But I've always sort of paid attention to what he says. And I've also criticized him for some of the things that I didn't feel was right, but that was my opinion. And I'm entitled to it, and so is he. So in this tweet, he says, listening to the stories of US Capitol Police has me all kinds of confused. How do white cops not shoot a mob of violent white supremacists armed with weapons trying to kill them, but fear for their lives and shoot unarmed black people running from them. Make it make sense. And I don't think that there's a more relevant question to ask today. Because today we have to learn that we cannot do it exactly the same way as we have been doing it. And I've categorically explained the political parts of it. And today I'm going to explain to you the historical part of it, at least from my vantage point. So this is sort of an ethnography. This is sort of a perspective. And I always say in all of my episodes that you go find out for yourself. Look at everything that I'm talking about and go find out for yourself. So I have a cheat sheet for this one because this is a massive topic, but it's the same cheat sheet as I had for the other big ones. I'm not going to break this one up. It's going to be long because the topic is long. So bear with me, please. I don't know if it's going to be worth it for you, but I feel it an imperative. And the reason, I just before I started this stream, I wrote a tweet to Bishop Swan saying that, if I asked for forgiveness if anything that I commented to him on his comments that he actually got to saw, because, he's a giant and I'm an ant in the verse of digitalness. So, and then I said, I'll be talking about this. And I believe that God made you write this tweet. And, God, universe, how Allah, Bhagwan, whatever you want to call. These are the ones I know, and I'm ignorant because there are so many more ways, so many more names. And in the Rig Veda, in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the Vedas, Rishi Bharadwaj wrote Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Now, I don't know if it's exactly Rishi Bharadwaj or his father or grandfather, Angiras, but which means the truth is one. Sages call it by many names. Sages means people who have the wisdom to understand, because all wisdom is understanding something. And so I'll start with something I wrote, and it's a short poem that I wrote on July 3rd, 2011. It's called Ramson, and this is from a new publication that I did, which was sort of a memoir publication that consolidated the last 10 years of my of the tribute projects. So this one says, this is Ramson. Rampant starts on swampy shores, built with might, filled with hope, layers of tunnels in its gut, bridges line it, down and up. Greatest among homesteads, a phoenix burning blue-red. First in many it leads in stride, its steeled commerce built with pride. Alleys form its capillaries, driving life to the core. The ergoline spine transmits life from the white city to its speckled shore. Land of change, the city that fights. Land of right, the city of heights. Land of plenty, my city of means. Sweet home Chicago is made of dreams. Background. Now, mind you, caveat, this background was written in 2019 when I published the penultimate of my publications, self-publications on Amazon. Anyway, so the background is a homage to Chicago. Ramson refers to a type of wild spring onion, Chicago, that grew abundantly in the swamplands that once existed where the city now stands. Defined by nature, Chicago's architecture and urban planning set the precedent for modern-day skyscrapers and multi-level megacities. Home of the world's first megatall skyscraper, Willis Tower. I still like to call it Sears Tower, but Sears is kind of like history. Children born today won't know Sears. This part is not part of the background. Back to the background. Lower Wacker Drive, commerce and prairie styles of architecture, and the bridges over its namesake river that its planners reversed. Chicago rose from the Great Fire of 1871 to become the fastest growing American city at the turn of the 20th century. A melting pot of cultures, religions, and minorities fleeing persecution, all against the backdrop of the white city. This dynamic, speckled identity defines a city to this day, with starkly separated ethnic, racial, and economic neighborhoods. While on one hand it preserves a level of authentic multiculturalism, it also creates separatist environments and income disparities that fester anger, create misconceptions, encumber self-aware integration, and passively enable exploitation and corruption. Famous for its crime and crooked politics, the Windy City gets its nickname from its gas-filled politicians, not because it's windy, because it's not always that windy, you know. That's where I own my first home, so I kind of know. I lived there for some time. A broad-shouldered ideological background and home of America's first non-white president, Barack H. Hussein Obama II. Chicago diligently competes to outperform itself. So there's a reason why, I wrote that background, and the reason why I wrote that poem, because one of the focuses when I was studying in undergrad, my last 2 years, I really focused on race and gender and masculinity, because from a personal standpoint, I was dealing with being gay. And from a social and community standpoint, I was becoming aware, not aware, I was aware for some time before that, but becoming more cognizant and curious about the nature of race politics in America. Let me just click this off. Now, so for that, I have to go back and I have to tell you the background and the answer to Bishop Swan's question. And for that, I'll have to go back and I'll start with the Bible. In the Bible, there are the very first story of the forbidden fruit and Adam and Eve is actually sort of a warning. It's a disclaimer. It's a story that explains to you the importance of understanding the knowledge that you acquire. And knowledge is power, yeah, wisdom is understanding. And now, where was I? Knowledge is power, wisdom is understanding. And did I backtrack. Where was I? Oh, okay. And so the forbidden fruit in the Bible, see, I went back like that long, so it was hard for me to keep track because I keep leaping back and forth. And we have to keep leaping back and forth and like build this matrix of ties, of these stories, because these stories are eternal, you know, and the messages are eternal, because the human condition, as long as humanity is around, is eternal. So the caution in that story is that if you take the fruit of the tree of knowledge, if you take the fruit without understanding the root, how it came about, and I talk about that in my karma video, which I did a long time ago. Seems like a long time ago, but it was last year. So, and the punishment for that is the banishment from heaven, because your state of mind is fundamentally altered when you have knowledge and you aren't able to understand it. And the forbidden fruit and the snake reference, it's very eerie, and I'm actually working on an installation right now that is called the Kundalini, and I have written about it on my website. In the Vedic philosophies, because I briefly touched the Bible, right? And so that was the caution in the Bible in the very beginning, is that there's all of this knowledge coming to you. Everything is coming. And it starts with the human part of it, starts with Adam and Lilith and Eve, and you know, one man and two women. God knew what he was doing, if God were to be a he. And I believe God is God. I just said God was a he by a slip of a tongue because of inundation. And inundation is part of today's topic. Very much squarely so. So these things that we have to change are things almost like, you know how they say, when you're habituated and you always have held your hands like this, it's like nearly impossible, and it's like really, it's very difficult for me. If I do this, for me to, yeah, see now, it's not, yeah, so that's inundation. This is muscle memory. I don't know what this is, but that is how pervasive brainwashing is, if it's done over time. So in Genesis, the Bible warns that there's a lot of information coming. And if you just take that knowledge and don't understand it, don't process it, don't look at it through the kaleidoscope of existence, through the totality of the circumstances, which happens to be a legal phrase, legalese, you will be forbidden from the heaven of understanding exactly what that is, in reference that transcends space and time. So now, and we've seen that people have taken the story of Genesis and taken it and warped it and taken it and done so many things, and what's the original sin, and made Adam and Eve, and that's all about the power paradigm of supremacy. You know, men realize, and I'm saying this today as a man, as a gay man, so I'm kind of like the third sex, that men figured out when they penned the Old Testament that they weren't going to be able to defeat women in society through justiciable and truthful means. They'd have to be sneaky as shit. So, you know, they warned, because there were women, two women and one man looking and writing. I'm thinking about Adam and Lilith and Eve, right? I'm just thinking of it. I mean, because you have to. And I'm not doing that with the Quran for a specific reason. But I'm not going to go any further. But this is my perspective, and I have the right to it. In Vedanta, this idea of the forbidden fruit is said in a way that is easier to understand, I feel. And that's why I think that at least Genesis, at least this story of the forbidden fruit, wherever it originates, is older than the Vedanta Vedic tradition. So, but they're wholly independent from, as far as we know now. And if somebody knows differently, please point that out, because I haven't followed that historical connection part of it, that intersectional part of it, because it could have happened. People could have traveled. It's naive of us to think that no one was curious 2,000 years ago. I mean, we kind of forget how we walk and how we learn to walk, and then we think about flying when we forget about even walking, and we start dreaming about flying, and by then walking even, it's all fucked up. We dream so much bigger than we can do, but we can achieve what we dream if we just work towards it. Now, in Vedanta, it says that the human tree has its roots up in heaven, and its branches come down, and the fruits bear, and the leaves bear upside down. And then for a long time, I didn't understand what that was. And it was transcendence of thought. It was the spine. It was the brain, and then each part of your brain that administers every single aspect, which is the head of your head part. Then there's a throat part. All of these things. 7 segments of your spine, effectively, including your brain. So I got 6 plus brain. Now, so in order to understand, and all of this background is for me to tell Bishop Swan that, I was thinking about this, and you asking that question, and me finding the right honing place and top time to talk about it, what I have studied unbeknownst to what I would be talking about today, is nothing short of a miracle to me. I believe in God. I believe in the notion of everything, if you watch any of my other episodes. Now, I may have to take a quick break to go get a bottle of water because I'm getting a little raspy. So I think this is a good time to break. 1 second. Thank you for waiting. So I had to let the dogs out. That's my person who helps me with everything. So yeah. So going back to the history of, now starting with the history of America, I had this professor, and it's been so long, and I graduated undergrad in 2005, and there was this professor, and she was fantastic, and she we did race and gender, was race specifically. And in that class, I learned that literally the country was built on the shoulder of African slaves at the time, so African Americans, because as much as that country became a white man's, it also became a white woman, a black woman's, and a white woman's, and a black man's. But a white man didn't allow that to happen because of the power paradigm that was at play, which is supremacy. Now, it was literally built, trade, infrastructure, everything was built by African Americans. And as more and more people found opportunity or heard about the United States and how it was growing and how it was the place of dreams, and and that started all the way back when Christopher Columbus, who totally went the wrong way, ended up on the shores of America and thought it was India, and that's why Native Americans are called Indians. And so we have to start learning to call them Native Americans. We have our first Native American Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. The question is, she's a 35 generation American. The question is, why isn't there a why hasn't there still been a Native American president? I mean, why is there still this segregation of reservations? You have to question. And then on that, I don't have any expertise because I don't have any background on the history of Native American, but except for the fact that they were totally just massacred, and I mean, I know some parts of it, but and this power paradigm obviously had a part to play in it, and the concept of savagery had the part to play in it, mind you. So what happened with as white men colonists came around and colonized and brought slaves, African Americans, to the United States, that expanded over time. On one side, trade and infrastructure was being built by African Americans. And on the other side, there was this imperial mindset sort of settling in under the genuine interest of a lot of our founding fathers as it developed over time, as independence, the War of Independence happened. And that history even I haven't studied because but this ideology of supremacy and masculinity and this ideology of dominance through whatever means that we are seeing in its most, as I'd like to say, I don't know, I don't want to be derogatory, the most basic way. Now we're getting to see that it's barefaced, and our previous president sort of cracked that egg open, and now we get to see it, and now I feel it's important for us to talk about it and deal with it. So it pervaded that this Judeo-Christian biblical story was warped in such a way that light and darkness became the distinguishing things became comparative to good and evil. And even the idea of good and evil became absolute, without any reference to or thought that Lucifer, the bringer of light, was a greater, more favorite angel of God than Michael before he defied God. Now, the story of the prodigal son, you hear that over and over again, once in the Old Testament and the New Testament and in folklore and all over the place. So it created this dichotomy right? This disparity or built in to the understanding of good and evil, the absolutism of supremacy, because that makes it easier for people to decide one is good and one is bad and gravitate towards one. And once people gravitate more towards one, then it can be manipulated as opposed to be thought as far more fluid of a system. So, and apologize for getting dark and light because I've had to open the balcony door for my children to go sunbathe after their lunch. They're very demanding. And somebody maybe she didn't understand or he didn't understand what was going on, that I spanked my little, they aren't little, 100 pounds, for being annoying for a minute, whatever. And just said, that one. That doesn't hurt even me. That just, whatever. Anyway. So, we get to see this ideology play out in slavery, in the cruelty and the torture of slavery, in the disparity it creates, but all the while there's this imperial almost overthrow that, no, on the surface, we don't want British control. We want our own imperialism. And we're going to guise that imperialism into the fabric of the nation and create this body of thought of originalism with the understanding that the Constitution of the United States only was for the white man. And this is why. Because their argument, and I think I'll probably touch by the 1776 Commission gaffe on my way out of this conversation. I don't know if you all can hear me very well because of the honking, but I hope so. I'm trying to get my voice to carry. Okay, so what happened was that? Yeah. Now, it was sort of this imperial side was growing, and so the founding fathers who were writing and drafting the Constitution had to do it as diplomatically as possible. Because they do realize that they had to, from the Declaration of Independence to the signing of the Constitution, I believe 1776 to 1789. I don't know the dates exactly. That period was of debate, and I know nothing of those debates, nothing at all. So I'm not going to talk about those either, because what came out of it, I know the end document. And the end document is the Constitution of the United States. And as much as the Declaration of Independence says all men were created equal, in reference to the white man, because at that time, women were chattel and slaves were chattel. So a black woman was just, I don't know, double chattel. And a black and Asian American woman, what would be triple chattel, right? Oh my God, right? Oh, by the way, I'm so sorry I didn't start with congratulations, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, on something that is just so compoundingly historic for the history of the United States and the creation of our Constitution on a philosophical and fundamental level, that it's forever changed now. It's forever changed. And the grateful nation must always remember Joe Biden for, if nothing, that he stood behind Barack Obama and today leads Kamala Harris, not just for the progress of women's rights or the progress of African American rights or the rights of anybody who is non-white, but for the understanding of what the Constitution fundamentally meant. And I believe to crack open the secret that our founding fathers had sown deeply into our Constitution, which is that despite the fact that this Declaration of Independence has the word men in it, that doesn't exist anywhere in the Constitution. There's no gender in the Constitution. There's no discrimination in the Constitution. The reason why I find this to be the living word, the true living word, and perhaps the last gospel humanity will ever need if we look to it and learn from it, is that it has created a form of government that is ever changing, ever evolving, that is dynamic and separated, and that's balanced by checks and balances. And that does not refer to discriminating factors. It is a purely governmental document that does not adhere to any philosophy whatsoever, with the exception of the preservation of the rule of law, which will apply equally. And it just so happens that the founding fathers, despite an enormous amount of resistance, got out the Bill of Rights as well. And they just couldn't get the Apportionment Amendment out, which was, by the way, the first amendment that was introduced to be ratified, which was about constantly or on a rolling basis review how, the amount of people, citizens that representatives, House representatives represented in the federal government. And I think it's high time that we do that, which is because right now 708,000 people to one House representative, and I think that should be cut at least in third. So I mean, or at least in half to start with, double them. So what? I mean, we're seeing now that every single thing is being done digitally. It can be done digitally. And it's relatively secure. And if it's not, that's what cyber command is for, especially if it comes to secured information and communication. So, we can do that. But we still haven't. Because why? The power. Because of power and because of this supremacy of imperialism that just couldn't take that. I mean, the lead amendment is still not ratified. We talk about the ERA not being ratified. That's still not ratified. I don't know if they ever go away. They expire. I don't know what. But now, so they got the Bill of Rights out. But mind you, originalism sprung out. It's kind of like the head of the Hydra, springing two heads, saying that no, this Constitution only says exactly what it says, and it only applies to exactly what it says, right? And many years after that this originalist idea came out, I think it's 1911. I think it's 1911 or 1910. There was a slew of cases that came out that were contractual cases that created this body of law, and I talk about it in my previous episodes when I'm less distracted by my dogs. So, yeah. There's this case that happens. I mean, it's just lobbing it out. So because they said, no, this originalism is exactly what it said. But then in these line of cases creates the precedent for substantive due process law, body of law, which I talk about in the reproductive rights video. And then that sort of gives right to Roe versus Wade. So they're completely opposed to Roe versus Wade. Now, it's, mind you, for a whole different reason. It's not about reproductive rights, it's about power and control. And it's about them being able to guide a certain demographic out of their own well-beings by connecting religiosity with the whole philosophy of the pro-life, right? So that's that other tangent. This is all it's the psychological warfare is just sewn in for so long that it's muscle memory. You don't think of it as being implanted into you, you know. So now there's a problem here. Hold, please. I'm wearing really bad pants. Okay. All right. So she's still sunbathing. I don't know how she does it. Yeah, so what happened was I got to get my train of thought back. So this is happening. This power paradigm is being perpetuated over time. But, you know, this originalism the thought of originalism that comes out, creates substantive due process, and then opposes it again, is doing it because they think that only white man has the rights that are enumerated in the Constitution. But our founding fathers were smart enough to get the Ninth Amendment out and to get the Bill of Rights out and ratified, to get these critical elements of an evolving, because and that you know, there are many scholars who have written books about it, and that is the ultimate goal of the originalist movement. That is the Federalist Papers and all of this. This is the first. It's the root of is American imperialism, you know, and the white man's property rights. And so it was just because of the Bill of Rights, it gave it a spin, the Constitution, a spin of liberty. That was to say that this will keep on evolving. This story will keep on evolving. This right will keep on expanding. Because they realize that the only way to get to a more perfect union is by constant practice. And, you know, our vice president talked about it I think in one of her speeches yesterday. And it's this constant practice of, you know, that's why I say doctors practice, lawyers practice, because you never become a perfect lawyer. You don't never become a perfect anything. It's a constant practice. Even the universe practices. God practices. Not everybody has the same and exact qualities and traits. Some people know something better than others. I sure as hell don't know anything about what's under the hood of a car, for example. So now, because of the Bill of Rights, and because African Americans who were slaves started to learn how to read, and because these founding documents sparked curiosity and made people be empowered about the value of government and their government, that they had these rights by which they can let the people who they elected know, like being the power of the vote and the power of protest and the power of privacy which has been eroded by the war on drugs, by the way, which is one of the fruits of the poison tree of supremacy. So there's the poison tree of supremacy, and then there's the human tree of enlightenment. And it's all condensed all into Genesis in that one story. So, I mean, I don't blame people for not being able to figure that out. But I think the people who wrote the Bible also wanted people to figure it out in a very global understanding. I think every single one of these holy books, these hallowed texts, and the ones I'll only talk about the ones that I've studied, which is the Bible and the Gita and part of the Vedas. So, but these corollaries are pervasive, and if you talk to scholars, you'll see that the links are so very, because I think Genesis is part of the Islamic sacred text also, because that's also an Abrahamic religion. Now, as this, so this is how tied together Judeo-Christian philosophy, but also imperial propaganda is laced, because supremacy is as old as civilization. You know, I've talked about it in my previous episode, which is the ethnography of sociopathy and supremacy. Now, that I don't know, there's two people who are watching, and I can't believe they're still here. And I really amazingly want to thank you, whoever you are, for putting up with this. I hope it makes sense to you. I hope it does. Today, I haven't done the live stream because I really want people to either watch or be able to comment, so I can go back and address the comments later on. But thank you, whoever you are. Please spread the word if you think this video is going to help anybody understand what's happening. But you still haven't gotten to what we need to talk about, really. So, by the way, I'm wearing sweatpants, and I don't need to wear anything else. I just don't, because you don't get to see it, except for instances where my dogs are too needy and they need to sunbathe after lunch, that you get to see my raggedy pants. Did I confess too early? Were you able to see my pants? Okay, whatever. Now stay. ঘুমিয়ে পড়ো, শুয়ে পড়ো, দুষ্টুমি করো না. So, as this power play is going on, there are founders, and they have just sort of thought, so people started coming along, people who said, no, we don't like slavery. Slavery isn't right. How can you say this person isn't a man? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It wouldn't, how can you say that they don't have the same feelings as us? How can you do that? You can't do that. And the founding fathers, there's this cockamamie propaganda bullshit about the 1776 Commission. Listen, something as pervasive as slavery, something as rooted as supremacy, and slavery is a branch of that, cannot be uprooted by people who are not predisposed to violence, which now we know which part is predisposed to violence, or they don't really care whether violence happens or not, as long as they continue to maintain the status quo that's most beneficial to them. And you'll say, why white women? It's called subservience. Look it up. Now, they started figuring out that we're going to have to draft this and this Bill of Rights, and we're going to have to deal with slavery. But we can't deal with it. We can't deal with it. If we are to establish this country today that will endure the test of time, our focus needs to be on that country and its people. And at that time, Everybody else, and everybody, 100% of the people agreed that the white man was a man. About everybody else, they were suspicious. Even white women. And now by looking at Donald, oh God, I hope I never have to say that name again. You get to see what that is in its most condensed and incestuous form, So it's like King Joffrey, George R.R. Martin's sort of a soothsayer of sorts. But I think King Joffrey lived exactly as long as he should have, So Donald is an example of that. And going back to, then we go to Abraham Lincoln, who sort of condenses this, right? So these founding fathers said, we can't get rid of slavery. We can't just draft this with the notion that all men, that included white women and slaves, because society and the status quo of supremacy, that's not the levers of economics just wouldn't let that happen. It just wasn't a thing. It just wasn't. But the founding fathers intended it to happen. And here is why. Because had they not, then the Constitution of the United States would have been exactly like any other constitution that you see all over the world, and its verbosity and its complications but the Constitution itself is very small. And it leaves fundamentally everything to interpretation. Because this is how it works fundamentally. The three branches of government: Article 1, Congress; Article 2, the executive branch, which is headed by the president; and Article 3, which is the Supreme Court. Mind you, it is just the Supreme Court and just the Chief Justice that is explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. And then it's said that more will be legislated. First check. Can be legislated. And thus every other federal court in the United States is created through constitutional decree of Congress by way of the Constitution. Now, then there is the legislative branch. Legislative branch is the first branch of government. It's the largest branch of government. It's the closest to the people. It's categorized in two. It's bicameral. The first chamber is the lower house, the House of Representatives. It's not really the lower house. It's the bigger house. We should be calling it the bigger house, and the smaller house. The bigger house, the House of Representatives, is the closest to the people because it is represented by people, by district, and by population. The smaller house, the Senate, is determined by states of equal right for every state of the Union, because each state of the Union is a sovereign that is joining the Union. And therefore the talk of secession and all of this. And people just don't know what secession can do. So, and what secession is. And half of them don't even know how to spell secession. So the ones who think of it as being a viable option. Because whoever wants to secede would just wither away. California, there's this movement of wanting to secede, and maybe it would survive, but I don't think any rightful person in California, or a significant majority in California, would ever want to secede from the United States. It just wouldn't be a good thing. And that's the most prosperous state. That's the biggest economy in the United States, and it's the fifth largest economy in the world. Fifth largest, mind you. So, all built on shoulders of African Americans, who white men call slaves because they were too scared. And then, when slaves didn't work out very much, so people started to learn, people started to be awakened to their civic duties of equality for all, and realized that when they said men were created equal, they really were trying to be prejudicial. But then they looked at the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and said, no, no, no. That was the Declaration of Independence. This is law. That was intent, and this is what came out of it. The Founding Fathers were smart enough to get the word man out of it. So, which I think was the faux pas that the people who wrote the Bible did, with starting with gender, but the man probably wanted to have his say. Wouldn't be surprised. Now, when Abraham Lincoln finally, the Emancipation Proclamation, abolition of slavery happened, this was a huge shock and a huge blow to white supremacy that was in America, but supremacy, mind you, because it wasn't just African Americans that were subjugated and enslaved. It was also Native Americans that invaders and imperialists slaughtered and massacred. And there have been times in history that wave of imperialism and has just taken over from the true intent of the Founding Fathers in the Constitution, not in the Declaration of Independence, was to deliver a more perfect union with the wisdom of understanding that the only way to do that is to broaden the scope. And so you'll read this if you ever read court opinions, Supreme Court opinions, that the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court has said in many cases that it has always been the tradition of this court to expand rights. In fact, that was one of the cruxes of Justice Kennedy's Obergefell opinion that expanded the right of LGBT people. Emergent rights. But this idea of emergent rights is instilled in the idea that the third branch of government interprets the law. So written in the highest supreme law of our land is that the third branch of government gets to interpret whether Congress, the first branch of government, has legislated the law and what that law exactly meant. That's not the avenue of the legislature, which is what a lot of the senators on the far right are doing now when they take the case to the court of public opinion. It's not their place to do that. It's the place of the courts. And I hope that legal experts look into that over time. Now, the court interprets the law and sees how it's applied. And in that interaction, the president's role is the enforcement of that law and the agency of all of these, all of the agencies, the law enforcement agencies, and the taking care of the duty of care that President Biden spoke about during his campaign. The duty of care is to faithfully execute the laws, because that is the duty of the president. Not to create the laws, not to abuse the laws, not to evade the laws, enforce the laws. Inherent in that is the limits of the presidency. And if you think words didn't mean and the placement of words didn't mean anything to our founding fathers, you have to read the Constitution. You have to understand this old common law idea of first in time, which literally for cave people is, if you go somewhere and there's no one there thousands of years ago and you plant a flag, as Eddie Izzard said some years ago, that's your land. But some people never got the memo about the flag, which was Eddie Izzard's story about it, which is an amazing episode, by the way. It's a long time ago. I don't know how long ago. Not that long ago, though. I mean, it's not like 20 years ago or something. It's like probably like 10 years ago or something. Maybe, whatever. So Abraham Lincoln was hated by the imperialists. hated by them. And Abraham Lincoln didn't start out as somebody who wanted to abolish slavery. He evolved into it. He grew into it. Abraham Lincoln's story is fascinating. He did so many things in his life that he failed in so many things and he learned so many things, but he never gave up. And that is more, that is exactly what you see, that what we see in President Biden. 50 years of public service, tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and the man never gave up. And then he held the hand of the first Black president, and now the hand of the first woman, African American, Asian American vice president. And that's the type of vision that our founding fathers intended. And now, this is why this story is important, and this is where we're going to get to the pertinent part. And the first hour has just gone into blah, 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 about the reference. So now, supremacy had to come up with a new idea. You couldn't call them slaves, but what you could do is translate this whole idea of savagery and good and evil and bad, black and white, and push that into the mainstream ideology that black was savage. It was savage. It was savage. And there's a history of why the Black church has such a special place in the African American community, because they saw that as something great to go to, but they were not allowed. And they experienced this disparity when the word of Christ is all about unity. But they realized, the leaders of these African Americans who were enslaved during slavery and then who were freed, but still enslaved by supremacy, because African American communities have been good. They have been hardworking. They have been industrious, but they have not been manipulative, which is fundamental in how imperialism has worked. And this wing of imperialism has come from people of a certain, mostly white. Mind you, this imperialist idea happens in and that's why you see speckles of other colors in the supremacist movements, like polyester and rhinestone and polyester. You know what I'm talking about? Rhinestone. Oh no, sorry, diamond and silk. And the other people, and there are other. You see these people because there's this brainwashing thing that happens, and this is the root of this brainwashing thing, is when they said, okay, so you're a savage, and so everything that happens in the Bible that makes you the villain, very much like in the Vedantas and in Ramayana, you become bad, you become savage. And so they couldn't do that with the church, because after the Emancipation Proclamation, Black churches started to empower themselves, right? So that had to go underground. Now, without it going underground, how did it still keep on going? By this idea of they're savages. Oh, they can do this because they're savages. But they can't do intellectual things, right? So as the years went on from the 1860s to the early 1900s, all of that started to happen, that there were African American writers and traders and dancers and singers and all of this thing coming up, and communities coming around in the world hearing about it. And now it's just, before it was just the French and the British and some Dutch and little colonies here, but now the whole world's coming from everywhere. Louisiana, the capital of the antebellum South. And that time, in the middle 1800s, Victorianism was the factor of etiquette, Victorianism, everything prim and proper, and, civility. And that's where the idea of savage came. We're civilized, and they are savages, and that came all the way and sort of kind of hit itself on the head on Gandhi's shoe or Gandhi's stick, you know, and by no act of Gandhi, they came and hit themselves on Gandhi's stick. But there, and this is not just, it's not white, mind you, it's a mindset. It's now, it's now most enunciated in the white demographic. But supremacy is an ideology, first and foremost. If you want to look at it from the broadest perspective, and I think it's important that we do at this point. So now, what happened now was these imperialists who had created this sort of notion of white being better than black because of this biblical context and this black savagery, blah, 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 that I've talked about for the last hour. This wasn't working because now they were becoming educated, and now they were worshiping God, and now they were understanding through the church, which became a place of education and enlightenment, not just of life, but also actual education, that, hey, we're equal. And not only just the God, Jesus said so, it's also in our Constitution by way of the Bill of Rights and also by way of checks and balances, separation of powers, because it said so. And we have followed all the case law since. So I'm like, oh, fuck, imperialists. That's me, imperialist channeling. So what they have to do now, this is coming up to the early 1900s and the end of the 1800s, the Columbian Exposition, the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago happens, which was revolutionary in many ways. But there was the Midway, and then there was the White City. The Midway was the world, and the White City was everything that was imperial. And you see that in the Roman architecture and in the opulence of the White City and the speckled shores of Chicago, even to this day. Now, these so they realized this wasn't working. The savagery thing isn't working because, you know, like now we have to deal with not only, you know, black people, we have to deal with Asians, and we have to deal with Asians from all different kinds of Asia. So they're all like, oh my goodness, all this happening. And then in the 1900s, it started to become more aggressive, right? Because now it was getting really, because now, oh my goodness, slavery was abolished. So one shackle had been taken out. So the philosophy changed of imperialism in America. It said, no. For us to maintain power, we can't be Victorian. Victorianism has emasculated us, as if their stupidity wasn't good enough for that. Now, so we're going to have to just slowly wean away from that and explore the world of the wild. And so Theodore Roosevelt famously has this portrait in the White House where he's sitting on this horse, and this horse and he's pointing. I mean, the man was little. He wasn't like 6 feet. I think he was like 5 something, if that. And he's just standing on this big horse, and this horse and him are almost the same. And he becomes this wild, and he's done a lot of good, don't mind you, but he was dressed in the imagery of the wildlife person, the gun-toting, the hunting person, the masculinity, because it had to juxtapose against what they called savagery. Because Victorianism wasn't working for them if they had to follow this trajectory of power and control. So that now we come. So that you see that in Teddy Roosevelt. And you see over that turn of that century, the culture of America changes. You see that in the furniture, you see that in the architecture, you see that in any sort of fluidity, any sort of it all becomes very rigid. It all becomes very, no, women can continue, but not the men. Because at that time, the 19th Amendment hadn't happened either. If they had known what was coming, they were going to shit a brick and a half. Now, so the turn of the 20th century happens, and Theodore Roosevelt is going away. And then there's this fight that happens. And there's this, so as this masculinity paradigm is going up in the United States as the power factor of supremacy, and in America, white supremacy, because it's, if you were to go into the minor premise of it, that white supremacy, now it is between the black savage, who they can't really justify as a savage anymore, or a slave anymore, and the battle of might. No, we are, you know. So the former world heavyweight boxing champion, Jim Jeffries, comes out of retirement to challenge and fight the star of the time, Jack Johnson, who was an African-American boxer. And Jack Johnson beats Jim Jeffries. So now, all of that they worked out for the 40 years that went from the Columbian Exposition, maybe 10, 20 years before the Columbian Exposition, to about 10 years into, like 1910, 1911. I don't know exactly when Jack Johnson happened. But this is all very fluid. It's happening. It's just like you see it happening now. But it's far more condensed now, because you can sort of grab onto it and realize it, because it's recurred and you've seen it happening and it's changing forms. But the ideology isn't changing, the oppression. And if you want to go to the history of it, you can go to the previous episodes that I've done about the ethnography of supremacy and sociopathy. There's another person who's come and liked, and I really like to thank you for it. And if you want to talk to people about coming and joining this stream and watching and continuing, and then going back and watching it later on, they're welcome to do so, because the good parts are coming up. So when that fight happened, it shattered this idea that masculinity, of the white masculinity, was better than the black savagery. And they couldn't fight in any arena. And they were in a nosedive. And that happened to be around the time when, and I don't want to wrongly remember the names. I think it's a Lochner line of cases. I have to look it up. You have to look at my the reproductive rights episode about women and reproductive rights and Roe versus Wade. I talk about it extensively in that one. It just so happened that in that time period, there an imperialist Supreme Court, which was the Republican Party at the time, it had switched hands, and I don't know much about the previous earlier. My focus, my very honed focus, was this 40, 50-year period of American history of race, gender, and masculinity. It's just uncanny. And I latched onto it, and I've followed that, and I've synced history with it to see what plays out. And so just at that time, in the turn of the 20th century, while this notion is shattered of white masculinity, which was the post-Victorian idea of the white man, there was this crisis. And imperialism had to realize, supremacy and white supremacy realized that they had to go into laws and sew laws in such a way and bring back, revive in full steam the idea of originalism, to be able to stay away from social issues as much as possible on the light side of it, and outright prohibit some if that can be beneficial to them keeping power. Case in point, reproductive rights. So, mind you, imperialists don't care whether about religious rights either. Because fundamentally, as I've mentioned previously, religious rights was the crux by which this philosophy of dominance has been perpetuated by misunderstanding it, right? So there's this identity crisis. And this identity crisis, you see that the most distilled form of it is the blue wall of silence. I don't need to say anything else. You look it up. Blue wall of silence. So after January 6th, if you don't know what the blue wall of silence is, if you compare January 6th to the Black Lives Matter protest, then you don't know what it is, and you need to figure it out if you're an American. Now, so it gets, and also at that time, it just so happens that in the Bowery in Lower Manhattan, in New York, the culture of LGBT rights starts to come up. LGBT rights just start to rise up. So on one side, they have just lost their war with the black man. And they have also, in that time, with the passing of the 19th Amendment, lost their war, the white man's property rights war, against women. And in the Bowery of New York, the LGBT community, after seeing what was happening, started to rise and started to become more prominent. And it just so happens that the U.S. military, where they were shipped the ports were, New York, San Francisco, became hotbeds of homosexuality and the LGBT community because, you know, I mean, I don't need to go into why, because it's because people like to, you know, do things, and naughty things. So the Bowery and the philosophy of the wolf and the philosophy of the pansy and the fairy, because of superiority and the simplest of minds and the most people who don't think much about the philosophy, psychologies, and are daily working people and hardworking people, and people who, even if they would figure it out, don't care. They don't realize these underpinnings that are happening. They're just going about their lives. So this crisis. And so what happens is that, mind you, while they are doing this, their court has already done the substantive due process body of law, which 40 years after that goes on to creating the Griswold versus Connecticut is the landmark case that goes on to create reproductive rights. That was the right to contraception. And what a liberal court, what I would think would be a proper constitutional court and not an imperial court, which will, by the way, what we have now is as close to an imperial court as we have gotten in quite some time. And that's a topic for another time. Hopefully by the time this bench evolves, this conundrum can be resolved. Now, they had to go into laws. They had to make it disparate. They had to change the laws around. So they started to change the laws around different states. And they started to say, we're going to give states more authority now. We're not going to be federalist. We're not going to be for the federalist government. We're going to be for limited government. We're going to give more states power. You know, we're going to invest in the idea of originalism, you know. But we cannot say it was just the white man's property right. So what are we going to say? Because at this time in the early 1930s, early 1920s, it had just, you know, there was just, you know, the Gilded Age, or around the time Gilded Age, The Great Gatsby, all of this happening. Why? This opulence that we see again in Donald. Why? Because there's this deep insecurity that we're losing our grip on power. America is truly becoming a multicultural melting pot where everybody is treated equally, as intended in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So it's panicking. So disparate laws come up. States are given more latitude to create laws. Their constitutions and constitutional amendments come to surface. Because those are now the only ways to keep that disparity alive. And that they're also concurrently using faith. But the hypocrisy of that faith was revealing itself, and therefore there was a huge drop in white churches across America in the 30s, 40s, and onwards, up until Ronald Reagan. And I'll talk about that another time. But then came the time of inundation of disparate laws and reinforcement of the savagery, black is bad paradigm. And it became obvious. And it gave rise to the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement had been, had been brewing for decades before that. But that was a culminating point. Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott King and Malcolm X and members of the, People Nation. I don't know that history either, because my focus again was in a period before that. But I think the period I'm talking about is crucial because it created this disparate body of law while their imperial court had already created the precedent for substantive due process by a contractual law case that would eventually come up to become the backbone of reproductive rights, of LGBT rights, of family rights, of associative rights, of freedom of speech rights, unenumerated rights that were emergent rights, as Justice Kennedy put it. Emerging rights, and broadening the scope of our republic. So civil rights movement happens, and they are at a loss. They see these white people, and they can't believe that white people are wanting to give their power. White men are wanting to give their power away. But they can't go out and tell other white men who don't think about politics and psychological manipulation that this is really why we need to keep, because we're losing and we need to cheat. So disparate laws didn't work. Civil rights movement happened. We're dealing with this. So how are we going to deal with it? We're going to deal with it on a very fundamental. We have to bring back the root Aryan, the KKK, and we have to bring that back. We're going to have to revive that supremacy, that unadulterated supremacy, a movement supremacy. Will have a face and a body and it will become the grand dragon. Blah, 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 whatever. So you see that it is, you create this lens that puts the Black Panther and the KKK in one. No, it's not the same. It's not the same. The Black Panther movement is far more with Martin Luther King's, much closer. It's far radicalized. It's far right of the MLK movement, but it's still very damn left of the KKK. And it's still very democratic, and those ideologies are still very egalitarian. And that's where the unity is lost, because people are taught that white people and black people are different. And some of the most striking things, 2008 or something, law school graduate, we're both my friend, I graduated law school, my friend who was from Alabama told me this in 2008 or something like that at one point. In Alabama, still white and black churches, black people go to black churches, white people go to white churches. And I didn't know what that really meant. And I've studied it, I've looked into it more since then. And this is what. And so what happened was that was short-lived, mind you, because they kept putting veneer people, and then slowly after FDR, Truman happened. I think Eisenhower was Republican. I don't know, but it went underground, and the influence of it became more militant with KKK and supremacist groups, and they started to sprout out and go back to their Aryan propaganda roots. If you want to know more about it, go to the ethnography one video I had. And so after that, God, this topic is so long. How could they do that? Go underground. How could they seep into the structures? By law, by the people who enforce the law. We're gonna hit the politics of it, the pervasiveness of it. Underneath, we'll have the money. Over top, we'll have the religion and the reproductive rights baloney that we have been building for few decades now. Right? Roe versus Wade happens. They're like, oh fuck, and then the whole thing. And this whole time, it's this crisis of supremacy that is embodied majority by now in the white man. The white man's supremacy is in this extreme crisis of identity because they have lost all ground. They've lost all ground. And just a caveat, there's people have fear of dogs. People have fear of snakes. And over the course of hundreds and thousands of years, these fears, these behavioral fears from one generation to eventually gets coded into the genetic code. And I've read about it in a valid science magazine but I don't remember which one. You have to look it up. So that the fear of wild animals, the fear of darkness, it is cultivated. It's cultivated because once we went from darkness to light, going back to darkness seems a little scary. But we came from darkness and we went to light. So we can look back and we can learn. And that egg of their supremacy started to creep back with corporate deregulations. And then Nixon betrayed them by doing the EPA, because EPA is egalitarian. And many other things that would make Nixon a reasonably decent president now in 2021, all things considered. At least not the worst. So now this is desperate. And so this fear, mind you, so the Reverend Swan asked, Bishop Swan, not Reverend, Bishop Swan asked that why? Because this fear, this generational, multi-decade, centuries-long fear of savagery, of darkness, when nothing else could be found, was sewn into the enforcement of the rule of law on a grassroots level, the blue wall of silence. And anybody who goes into the police force, anybody who sees that, anybody who talks about it, anybody who placates it, need to understand it for exactly what it was. It was the hack into democracy. To be able to radicalize law enforcement from the very get-go of the formation of police departments, that this idea of masculinity, machismo, outdoorsiness would be part of them. And then as the years progressed, every one of these imperial notches, from the ones that didn't work before, so they had to go up then changed to disparate laws, then to disparate treatment, disparate impact, and the enforcement of it, the war on drugs, the erosion of the Fourth Amendment, the vast discretion of the police force and the law enforcement. It all was underpinned with this fear of light and dark, black and darkness, because that was the last thing they had left. And the only way to reinforce that, once the Nixon Humpty Dumpty cracked, was to sew it in with supremacy, masculinity, outdoorsiness, wrap it up into a bundle. And we all know what a bundle does to us when we go to the grocery store. We're going to give it to the people who like some of it and don't like some of it. But the ones they like are so close to them, both realistically or at least philosophically, that they will drift in our direction. They won't be radicalized yet, but they'll drift in our direction. So the law enforcement goes in, and that it starts to rot from the inside. And the people who become part of the blue wall of silence, who are of other races, of other cultures, of other genders, they first see this wall and they get hit in the head on it. They have to either resist it, be a part of it, be mute to it, or understand it in the lens of masculinity and enforcement of law and try to fit it into that. It's kind of like one of the ugly sisters of Cinderella trying to fit in the glass slippers. It just doesn't fit. And you start to see the cracks in this disparity that Bishop Swan talked about. Why is that? It's because it is sewn into them. It is because it is a generational thing that no longer needs to be reiterated, and it is the most distilled form. This inherent thing that if you go to a black neighborhood, the cops have to be extra scared of this idea that black people are more physically aggressive and less mentally acute. No, that's not the truth. The truth is darkness scares imperialism and supremacy. And they use they vilify darkness and make it into a tool to keep people in line by misinterpreting the Bible, misinterpreting the Constitution, restricting the intent of the founding fathers, all under the guise of rule of law when it worked, that it didn't all of those. That's why they don't want affirmative action. So you see how the dominoes are falling here. So if we are to uproot this, we need to address the fact that white men who still hold on to imperialism in America need to realize that it's okay. We understand you. It's not easy to lose a grip on power historically, which is thousands of years in the coming. And this is why you're going to see a lot of attacks coming at Joe Biden, because Joe Biden has broken the race dynamic, broken the gender dynamic, broken the multicultural dynamic by bringing in Barack Obama first and now Kamala Devi Harris. Kamala, mind you, this whole time, he said, Donald once said the Biden administration, but he has not once taken the name of Vice President Harris. And you will see, and what I saw today may have been, yesterday may have been sort of, unintended, but this is how pervasive it is. After Garth Brooks sang Amazing Grace, he said paid his respect to the President of the United States, Joe Biden, turned around, paid respects to the former Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, and then on his way out in passing, paid his respects to Vice President Kamala Harris. If And if you don't see a corollary between that and when that governor from wherever pointed her finger at Barack Obama, or when uh, uh, he was criticized for a tan suit, or when First Lady Michelle Obama was criticizing for wearing cut-off sleeve dress, a sleeveless dress, don't forget those and the disparity of supremacy coming to light, because this is how grand and this is how old it is. So now, with Kamala Harris becoming the vice president, the militancy is going to get really, 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 it's not gone. This is not gone. The ignorance isn't gone. It must be through our actions. It must be through our compassion. It must be through our understanding that we dispel them. And the only way we can do that is by accepting those people who still believe in that. And then accepting them as people, not accepting their ideas, accepting them as people, accepting them as Americans, and then showing us through our deeds by spreading the word if you know the truth, by doing what's good, by going out in the community and doing your service. I will come out and talk to you about what I think is relevant, as long as it takes for me to see somebody from the American foster care system become president of the United States. I've made that pledge in the first episode of Utopia. And that is a goal. That is a concrete goal. And if you say that phrase, at least you have to think about what all needs to happen for that to happen. How many things need to be fixed? And what in those things that need to be fixed need to be philosophically repaired? And that's how grand the task is of just for finally getting to what our founding fathers intended. And this is why the 1776 Commission is bunk. Because our founding fathers always intended for slavery to be gone. They just trusted people like the leaders we have now in our all avenues of society, like Reverend Swan and my friend Steve and my friend Daniel and now the vice president and Joe Biden. There will always be a threat to Joe Biden that will be almost like the threat to Abraham Lincoln, if not the same, because this was the last nail in the coffin of supremacy. And if we don't see it as that, if we just address it as a racial thing, if we don't see it as all of this that I've showed you, the tie up, and I've done it in 1 hour and 37 minutes, and there are two people who have stayed along, and I don't know who you are. Maybe I'll figure out in the comments, but I can't thank you enough for sticking by me. Mind you, I still haven't eaten all day today. I'm an external patriot who's an American citizen who voted, whose vote was counted. I have to say this because it's necessary, not because I think that they'll think that, but they don't think that because they really want to. They think that because the caked on conditioning is so pervasive that they can't not. So we have to expose these things categorically in whatever avenue. And people like Dan Rather and people like Mike Beschloss and people like Igor, I cannot pronounce the gentleman's last name, and Eugene Goodman and man, the heroes and Officer Janone and Officer Hodges and Officer Sicknick, and they're the heroes, and Speaker Pelosi, and at the very end of it, you see at the stage on the January 20th inauguration of Joe Biden that the country was united. There was one person who just couldn't take it. And that person is most emblematic of the very things we need to not espouse to be. The very things that our founding fathers wanted to get out in one fell swoop, but they knew they couldn't do it. And so they had to do it this way. And they gave us this charge, this responsibility to keep our republic, as Benjamin Franklin said, and then as Nancy Pelosi reminded us. So I'll end there. Now, if I've answered Bishop Swan's answers to why, it's because this fear is sown. This fear is part of the blue wall of silence. And if you are a non-white person who caters to the supremacist ideology, it'll also be part of your psychology. And that is a refuge. That becomes an institutional refuge. And if that institutional refuge expands, then you have law enforcement unions endorsing the facade of supremacy. And so you ask, well, how, why? So you ask how, why, when a black group of people come at them, that they have to charge is based on that savagery notion. If you say when white people come at them, the blue wall of silence doesn't base itself on the disparity of white and white. It does so on the disparity of black and white. So inherently, it kicks in. And if you cater to that ideology, it kicks in. And we saw on January 6th, for the people for whom it didn't kick in, for the people for whom it wasn't a thing. The biggest stories you'll hear is that, what I think Donald thought were more white people were as racist as he was. Or more white people in America were racist, and there were more racist of them, or more people who cater to this ideology of supremacy. Because there's so much. When there's that Nixon thing happened, and then they lost, and then they had to come back full force. They had to attack full force, get Jimmy Carter out, put in the veneer politician of a B actor who would espouse and promote war on drugs, forget the AIDS epidemic, and kill hundreds of thousands of LGBT gay men, and then have it go and become, even to this day, be a pandemic in the world. There are two pandemics ongoing in the world right now. There's the COVID pandemic, and the oldest one, which started in the early 80s under Reagan, which is the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Don't forget that. It's still around. There's no cure for it. So, and they created a mess. But the specific question of Bishop Swan is because it is sown in. Because they see, and inherently, just like seeing a snake would, for some reason, make people really terrified and scared. Even looking at an image of it, even if it's not a real thing. Or a dog, or a bark of a dog. Either it's acute experiential trauma, or it is chronic over generations and imprinted. Because I am convinced today, I stand today telling you that fear is a thing. But there's a healthy fear, and then there's a fear that is induced by manipulation. And that fear, the discerning between those two fears, is impossible for most people who don't understand the nuances of that fear. And those who do stand by what they believe to be true. And as truth is one, you see white people standing up against other white people who think that white people are better. And it doesn't make sense to you. You see white cops not doing anything, and even some other non-white but not black cops not doing anything when a mob, insurrectionist mob incited by a seditious conspiracy, charges into the Capitol. Because that instinct of running away from a snake or running away from a dog that is sown in without any foundational truth to it on an individual and community experiential level, just for the purpose of manipulation and control over time, has inundated and now been sewn into law enforcement and the military of this fear, of this despair. That's why they respond differently. That's why you can't figure it out and you can't pinpoint it. And you see some of the images of people, the 4 officers who went in, and then Breonna Taylor was murdered in her own home. One of them, I don't think, was white. I don't know. One of them looked that there was a mix going on there, which is now at this point in America and in India, everybody is mixed. Everybody's everything. And that's why the dangers. And so I hope that answers Bishop Swan's question, whether it was rhetorical or not, because it is really a question that needs to be answered and not be, obvious, it's white supremacy and racism. Yeah, it is. But it is also, but it is necessarily also the grander picture of it. And if we are to really follow the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln, Providence has given us the chance with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to do that, to finally become a truly egalitarian society. And with that, see a drawdown of military and an upkeep of social services. Not to become socialist, because those are also manipulations, people. And I'll do an episode on socialism and communism and capitalism and democracy and monarchy and authoritarianism and all of that. It's history 101. It's political science 101. And if anybody would have cared to say that, studying the humanities was worth it, no one did. And those departments weren't funded and they weren't competitive and people there weren't fun things to do. And I'm sure they will be now. But I think the time for us to go, 2020 hindsight is over, because now we don't have an excuse. The people on the fringes, people like me, immigrants and gay and chronically ill and dyslexic and people with learning disabilities and emotional distress and mental disorders, people with physical disabilities and cognitive disabilities, people of all colors, of all countries who come for refuge and huddle and yearn to be free. For that, and for our future generations, for kings and queens to be born in a country of equal women and men. Because America truly is a nation of kings, every single one of us. And incidentally, that phrase, and I'll end with this, Amra shobai raja in Bengali. We're all kings. Amra shobai raja amaderi rajar rajotte. We're all kings in this nation of kings. Noile moder rajar shate milbo ki satte. Otherwise, why should we play hand in hand with the king? I believe that's by Tagore, who was the first Asiatic Nobel laureate of the world, the first Asia Nobel laureate in literature from Asia, who was a Bengali. And we have not just and in Old English, the word king didn't necessarily refer to a gender as much as a role. And we'll talk about that in my feudal system, caste system episodes, which I'll do as part of Utopia. Because I believe the time has come for us to open our eyes. And I believe the time has come for us to understand that our mission is not to be better than others, but to together build a more perfect union. That was our founding intention. And that is what we need to hold close. So it's almost 2 hours. 2 people have stuck around. I cannot thank y'all enough. Thank you so much. Comment, subscribe, tell other people to come. Watch it in segments, speed up. I will try to break it up when I get a chance, but I'm just no one, and I'm an amateur really in this, and I don't know how everyone says I'm an amateur. People who are, I'm schizophrenic. The haters are the haters, and I love the haters because it gives me the footing to bounce and footing to jump and leap and dream. So thank you to all the haters, and love you to all the lovers, and special thanks to all the watchers, and even greater thanks to everybody who watches and then shares it and tells other people that we need to head it in the right direction, and this is the way, because this is what our founders say. Thank you. Bye bye now. Love y'all.